our time together tonight, we might begin on page 4 of the outline. Let's remove ourselves again in history back a few centuries ago, just a few, to an entirely different cultural and political, and of course now we're on an entirely different religious milieu, to better understand what was going on then, to better understand the New Testament, which ought to glorify our Lord Jesus Christ. The more things that we can know that will help us to unlock the understanding of the New Testament, then the better for us, and I'm sure the more glory to Him. That means we will misinterpret the New Testament less frequently the more we know about it. Now, page 4, we've jumped along with paganism. We're going to be on number 5. Page 4, number 5, entitled The Mystery Religions. Now, you may have never heard much before of emperor worship, and maybe you've never heard much of the mystery religions. I'm sure you're familiar with, well, like numbers 2 and 3, the occult and pantheons. And you're probably familiar with number 6, the philosophies. We won't spend much time there since we've discussed that before. And everyone's familiar with Judaism, which is the end of the study over on the next page. But numbers 4 and 5, not a lot of people know about, although in New Testament studies, and remember we're talking about New Testament studies, period between the Testaments doesn't prepare us for the Old. It's too late to prepare us for that. We're past that. But it's to prepare us for a study of the New. New Testament studies you'll see occasionally, sometimes more than occasionally, numbers 4 and 5. And if you're going to see any more often than the other, it would be number 5, the mystery religions. Tonight, I just want to do we'll kind of give you an introduction to the mystery religions, because they are fairly important, and there are many interrelated questions as you jump down to letters C and D there with their relationship or alleged relationship with the New Testament. And the next time we'll be looking at some of the examples of Serapis all the way through, what do we have, 5 there. I'll probably add to that. There are a few others, although those are the 5 significant ones, though. So why don't we see a show of hands? Who has ever heard about the mystery religions before? All right, just a few people. You probably come across them in reading or something, I would assume, at least this brother, and I don't know about the other. What about emperor worship? I mean, as a specific emperor worship, not just, well, that sounds like 2 words that could or should go together. All right, so that's not very many people here. I didn't think so. You ever heard of this? But if I were to ask, the occult or the pantheons, probably all the hands would go up. Okay, let's do an introduction then. They are very interesting. I find them much more interesting than emperor worship. Unlike emperor worship, the mystery religions were much more popular and prevalent. And strangely enough, we know more about them. I say strangely. Well, look at the title, Mystery Religions. Strangely enough, we do have more information on them during and after the New Testament era. Now that is when they are important, during and after the New Testament era. But they're important right during the time of the New Testament. Now if you remember emperor worship, our topic last time, emperor worship really is not that important. It's never really that important. But whenever it assumes any type of importance at all, that's not until the end of the 1st century. So that doesn't have much interplay with the documents of the New Testament. But mystery religions are something different now, because they do have something to do with the Christians, well, with people starting with Jesus' time. We don't even have to start up in the 4th decade. We can start way back at the beginning. The year 0, mystery religions are on the scene. They're more popular, they're more prevalent than emperor worship. They last longer than emperor worship. They're more widespread. They are more thoroughly practiced from the heart by the converts and devotees of the various expressions of the mystery religions. And so I think it's important for us to know just a little bit about them. It will probably take us 3 or 4 studies, I would say, to look at the mystery religions. Now, we'll start with their history. Their history happens to be the same as emperor worship. The people grew tired of the selfish, rapacious, bloodthirsty nature of the greedy gods. Pantheons were just out as far as the people were concerned, and they needed a new religion to fill that void. Now, with the pantheons out, back to the outline, I just might point this out. That's number 3. With the pantheons out, a new form of religion is needed. Some new form of religious expression is needed. The people are tired of these gods. If you think of the religion of the pantheons as a religion for and of and by the gods, it didn't have anything to do with the people at all. They could never tell when the gods were going to be throwing thunderbolts at them because their city or their home or their person had displeased one of the gods or goddesses. So it was a religion that was for the gods. It wasn't for the people. And of course, the people got tired of that, serving the gods for their pleasure, for their good, for their glory. The people not deriving any benefit from that. Unless, of course, Zeus came down and mated with your wife, then maybe you'd have something to be proud of. You'd have a half-god of a son or a half-goddess of a daughter. But who wants that to happen to your poor wife and this bearded clown from the top of the mountain come down? So the pantheons are out. Something new is needed, and several different things are introduced. One of those is number 4 on your outline, emperor worship. One of those is number 5, the mystery religions. One of those is number 6, the philosophies. Now see, I haven't drawn this connection, so make sure that you see this connection. The pantheons are out as far as most of the people are concerned because of the selfish nature of the gods and because of the non-human centeredness of the pantheons. They're centered on the gods and not on humanity. People don't derive any benefit from it. So they substitute. They introduce something new. They try emperor worship. And I don't mean they try them chronologically, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, EW, MR, and then the PH, the philosophies. They don't try them 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6. They try them all at the same time. They're all more or less introduced 1st century AD. Although you've got, and here will be a big problem if you ever try to nail any of this down, you have beginnings of them that are mixed with other forms of religion that may come a century or two earlier. And then you might have some vestigial remains that last past the time of the official death of that religious expression. We'll explain what I'm talking about more here in a moment. But they're all pretty much together chronologically. They try emperor worship. Some people try that, not many. Mostly the emperors in Rome try that. The mystery religions are tried by another group of people, and then later on we get to the philosophies. We'll explain what we mean by that. But the philosophies are also tried, again, by a different group of people. Generally by a different group of people than those trying emperor worship or the mystery religions, particularly the mystery religions. The philosophies and the MRs, as I might abbreviate it tonight, so I don't have to keep saying the mystery religions. The philosophies and the MRs just don't go well together, especially the people involved in both of those. So EW, emperor worship, was tried, but it fell short due to its totally political nature. Remember, that's really not a religion. It's a political move to try to get the people to rally around the patriotic ideal of the first citizen, the princeps of the empire. But the problem with that is essentially the same problem with the pantheons. Again, the people need something more personal. The pantheons, that involved a religion for the gods. Emperor worship involved a religion for the emperors. The people still don't have a religion, so they substitute something else. Something else is introduced, and that, of course, will be the MRs. Now, some more on the history, because this is probably the most crucial thing that needs to be understood concerning their origin, their historical rise and origin. Remember the conquest of Alexander the Great back in the 4th century BC, around 330 we should say. The conquest of Alexander the Great, as well as, that's one man, as well as the conquest of Rome, the military machine of Rome. For the first time it put the Western world in touch with the Eastern world. Or to say it another way, and that had not been done before, or to say it another way, they put the formal state religions of the West in touch with the unorganized, occultic, extremely mystical religions of the East. And what this brought about is what we call in religion syncretism. you've never heard of the word, you might as well learn it now. Syncretism. You can probably guess what it means. You know about synchronizing your watch. You know what the little prefix S-Y-N means. Sin or seen, with or together. Syncretism was a joining together of different moral or religious beliefs. You take religious belief A plus religious belief B, and you wouldn't get A or B as a result. You'd get C as a result. A syncretistic form of religion. And so here's exactly what we get. We get religious syncretism when we join the formal state religions of the West with the mystical religions, the religions of mysticism and the extreme forms of the occult in the East. As you should probably already know, that's where that originated, in the East, not the West. Then it brings about in religion what we call syncretism. Now, don't just think that syncretism is a word that can only be used with what I'm talking about right now. It can be used any way you want to use it, as long as you're talking about the joining together of two different types of religious expressions or forms or beliefs to get not one or the other out of that, but an entirely new one. You join your A and your B together and you get C. You have vestigial remains of A and B, but you still don't have A or B. You have vestigial remains of A and B, but you have a new religion. You have C. That, in essence, is what the mystery religions are all about. They're not something that is totally Eastern, therefore totally occultic and mystic, or mystical in the sense that they were originally in the East. Neither are they totally or entirely Western. But you have sometimes the same gods of the pantheons, same gods and goddesses of the pantheon. But now you've got a religion that has to do more with you because you involve those gods and your earlier religious beliefs, which we might entitle that as A, with some of the mystical notions of the Eastern religions that Western man had been put in touch with by the conquest of Alexander and the military machine of Rome. Now, the very things that the pantheons and the emperor worship expressions lacked, what these religious endeavors lacked, were the very things that made the mystery religion so popular. So let me list briefly what the people were after, and I think it should make sense. First of all, they wanted a religion, and the things that I list here or name will be things not found with the pantheons or emperor worship, but definitely found with this new syncretistic form of religion that we call the MRs, the mystery religions. And there are many of them, but they all basically are the same, though. First of all, they wanted personal meaning, personal fulfillment, more than anything, personal involvement in their religion. To borrow one of our American phrases, they wanted a religion for the people and not the gods or the emperors. Well, doesn't that make sense to you? Wouldn't you get tired of surrendering sacrifices to some bearded fool on top of a mountain that's always threatening to throw thunderbolts down at you, that never loved you, you never loved him? Those types of religion, the pantheons, never had any expressions of what we know of love and kindness. Remember, as we've studied ethics, sometimes the New Testament has been using Greek terms like humility, long-suffering, Greek terms that were taken over from the Greek language that had either negative or passive meanings to them earlier. Christianity took them over and changed their meaning. To be humble was a horrible thing as far as the Greeks were concerned. They took those terms and baptized them, as it were, gave them Christian significance. They weren't Christian terms, but gave them very few words in the New Testament were coined by the apostles or by the first century church. They took over the language of the Greeks and turned a negative or passive word into a positive one, an active one. They baptized it, in essence, turned it into a term with Christian significance. And I don't think we could fault the people for this. Being involved with these pagan gods or these pagan emperors that want your worship and yet you don't derive anything from them or from that form of religious belief, the people really are tired of this. This isn't just something I'm saying. This was something that I'll say that. I'll make a comment about it here in a moment. But it was something universal in the Mediterranean world going on around this time. People wanted personal involvement in their religion. Secondly, they wanted deeper present spirituality. We're going to kind of laugh at this deeper present spirituality, or we're going to put spirituality in quotation marks by the time we get through with some of their orgies and revelry that took place with the MRs. But anyway, that's what they were after. And thirdly, the promise of an afterlife. Spiritual, personal immortality. Emperor worship didn't guarantee that. Neither did the pantheons. Now look what you have down on your paper there with 1, 2, 3.
Wow.
Don't we see yet another way in history where Galatians 4:4 is confirmed, which is what we started this class off with. In the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son.
Amen.
The fullness of time. Not earlier, not later, the fullness of time. And these three things, did not Christianity come offering these very three things here? Of course, the mystery religions were a satanic substitute. The people had true, genuine yearnings of heart. And so to satisfy these needs, Satan sent the mystery religions and God sent the Son. And those who either never heard or didn't receive the latter were inducted into the former. They'd never heard of the Son or didn't receive the Son that God sent, then Satan was right there with the mystery religions. Mark chapter 1 and verse 15 was also another verse we used with Galatians 4:4. There we're told that Jesus came preaching, started it off with this statement, the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Mark 1:15. Repent and believe the gospel. So God, in more ways than one, had the world ready. And we looked in the first 2 or 3 messages with the intertestamental period class here. We looked at the fullness of time. We looked at it politically with the Pax Romana. We have a period of peace. You don't have that many wars going on, so Christianity can spread rather freely. The roads, the language of Greek being spread everywhere, one language, you can go as a missionary everywhere and people speak that. God's preparing His people, the Jews. That's where we basically majored whenever we looked at the religious aspect of the fullness of times, that God was preparing the Jewish people for this. But He's even preparing the pagans in that through His providential control of history, not of nature here, but of history, the pantheons have run their course. And people are fed up with serving gods and getting nothing out of it. No promise of an afterlife. The only promise you have is a promise of a threat that if you don't do everything just right, this God may cut you off. And what they're wanting is personal involvement, a deep, present spirituality, and the promise of personal immortality. So I wanted to bring that out, that history again confirms Galatians 4:4, that God, the fullness of time, God sent forth the Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that He might redeem those under the law. But Paul's writing there in Galatians about the Jewish question. We'd have to go somewhere else to find out, and to redeem some of those who weren't under the law as well. But Satan is right there to bring his counterfeit, the mystery religions. He sees what the people are after. He sees their heart, how their people are changing. They're wanting something different. But it's just, well, almost ab initio with Satan, almost from the beginning, whenever God is going to do something or does something, Satan almost always has a counterfeit right there. And very real counterfeit, because these mystery religions, of course, they were lies. They were satanic delusions. But they offered these very things. Now, definitely they offered personal involvement. Everyone got involved. Deeper present spirituality, well, it was certainly a perverse form. It was spirituality in reverse, or backwards, or upside down. And the promise of an afterlife, well, both the dead, righteous, as well as wicked have an afterlife. They'll live. They're immortal in spirit. But both of those groups won't have a glorious, immortal existence in the afterlife. Some will have a good and some will have an evil, of course. So, the mystery religions, which came from the Orient, came from Egypt, finally one originated in Greece itself, became the leading form of religious expression in the Roman world of the first century and afterwards. We're, of course, excluding Christianity here. And the mystery religions probably touched more people than Christianity did anyway. You always have fewer on the side of the truth and God than on the side of Satan and that which is wrong. But the mystery religions come from the Orient, they come from Egypt, First one we'll look at, Serapis, comes from Egypt. Most of them, because we've talked about the connections between the West and the East, come from the Orient. And then, of course, Greece has one or some of her own that originate. So I would name those three places as the places of origin for the mystery religions. The Orient, by that we mean Mesopotamia, India, the Parthian Empire, Egypt, and Greece. And you probably heard me just emphasize that I would say the mystery religions, the MRs, are the leading form of religious expression in the Roman world of the first century. The first century as well as thereafterwards. So that's why we need to know something about them. It's not the pantheons as you may have thought before. Well, I've heard of Zeus and Jupiter and all of this. That must really be important. They're passing off the scene now. They have their devotees, but they're not as many as they were before, and large numbers of people, droves in fact, are turning. Most of the Mediterranean world is turning to the MRs. Now let's look at some characteristics. What are these mystery religions then? We've described their importance, their history, their origin, what the people are after. What are these mystery religions? Because obviously you probably don't remember in the New Testament coming across that term, well, Paul writing over here in Romans, now don't get involved in those mystery religions or something. Although, by the way, you might remember places like in Revelation, Mystery Babylon there. Paul using this term mysterion in the Greek all the time, 27, 28 times of mysterion. Well, we'll have to discuss that maybe later on. That's a complicated issue, mysterion. We'll have to see. But anyway, you're familiar with Revelation, though, Mystery Babylon. Now, is that a play on mystery religions, or is it a coincidence? Remember, we've seen some that would appear like a play on emperor worship last time. Just a coincidence. It couldn't be a play on it because it'd be anachronistic, because what we have in the New Testament actually comes first. Emperor worship comes later. So how could they be writing as a slight against EW when it doesn't come on the scene for another 20 or 30 or 40 years? So characteristic number one, probably the most important, has to do with the very term mystery. Now mystery doesn't necessarily always imply secrecy. Now that'll be a point that will prove important later on. But in this case, it does. In other words, you've heard of people speak of an open secret. Now, that's really not a contradiction in terms. It could be a secret in one sense, but yet be open in another. So mystery doesn't always necessarily imply secrecy, but in this case it does. Secrecy was the chief element, the chief characteristic of the MRs. But what I just said will be a point that will prove important later on. That mystery, by the use of the term mystery, by the use of the term mysterion, we do not always necessarily imply secrecy. It could be that which was but is no longer, what we might call an open secret. So secrecy is the chief element. The death sentence was given to any of the devotees about which it could be proven that they had disclosed the secrets of their particular cult. That's how serious they were about secrecy. I'm getting ahead of myself, but you see, that's not exactly like Christianity. We're supposed to go tell the secrets of our religion. But you see, in one sense, they're secrets, though, because you can tell someone until you're blue in the face. But unless the Holy Spirit gives them revelation of what you're saying, it remains an open secret. It's open. All they have to do is just look at it and believe the gospel. But if he doesn't give them repentance and give them light in that area, then it's open, but it remains a secret to them. Christianity doesn't have the death sentence if you talk about it. Wouldn't that be something? It's fascinating this form of religion spread so quickly. You couldn't tell anyone about it. So you didn't go out and proselytize any. People just knew about it and found out about it in the droves, though, and you'll see more how and why as we go along here. Well, if this is true, and it seems to be that the death sentence was passed, given to those who disclosed or revealed any of these secrets, we might ask the question, well, how do we know anything about it at all today then? Seems like that would have all been shut up in a hurry. But we do have a few different sources available. Let me name about three. Some are more developed more profuse in their revelations of this secret than others. And when I say that secrecy was the chief element, that meant secrecy in thought, word, deed, writing, expression, anything. You couldn't even act out the religion by, a dance or a play if you're going to act it out to tell someone that was not supposed to know. But here are some of the ways that we found out, because just because people are bound with this oath of secrecy doesn't mean they're going to keep it. Sometimes by virtue of the fact someone forbids you to tell, it makes you want to tell even more. So number one, in art. One of our biggest ways we find out something about the MRs is through art. Vase paintings, reliefs, frescoes, inscriptions, sculpture, paintings, and the like. Many different sources of art. People described some of the ceremonial aspects of one branch or one cult of the MRs, thereby giving us a little light into that dark cavern. Secondly, writings. Some would carelessly write to another devotee about their religion, and then that writing would be lost and covered in the sands of Egypt, some piece of papyrus, and it would be discovered centuries later. And then thirdly, here's a way you might not have thought of, but it's one we should probably think of first: Christian converts. There were Christians involved in the mystery religions. I mean, before they were Christians, as unbelievers involved in the mystery religions. Whenever they were converted, well, they were not bound by those demonic oaths or satanic rituals anymore. Some of the early church fathers came out of the mystery religions, and they wrote much about the internal workings of the MRs. Now, to be fair to the MRs, though, we have to say that sometimes the church fathers were not. By that I mean sometimes they were so biased in their presentation that they tended to overdo what the mystery religions were all about. But having said that, let's be fair to the Christian side and the church fathers. It's almost hard to overdo the baseness and the carnality of the MRs. So even though some of the church fathers may have been a little biased, and whether they are or not, I don't know. I haven't searched that out myself. It wouldn't bother me one iota. I know enough about the MRs to know it's hard to overdo them. It's hard to be biased about something. When something is as bad as the MRs, then how can you make it badder? You're just giving us the details of what you saw and what you experienced. And how could it be any worse? So as its name implies, there's the first characteristic: secrecy. The mystery religions, secrecy. Okay, secondly, in some way similar to our present-day secret societies and other religious cults, one's entrance into a mystery religion was accompanied by oaths and secret, elaborate initiatory rites. Very elaborate ceremonial, seasonal services took place with the prospective initiates or devotees to one of the MRs, much like our secret societies today and other religious cults today. You notice I said other. Accompanied with oaths and secret, elaborate initiatory rites. Now, you can have some well-known secret societies like the Masons, or you could have something just as common as your college Sigma Chi fraternity, or Sigma Chi as maybe it should be pronounced in Greek. And they've got all of their elaborate initiatory rites and services through which one has to go in order to gain entrance. And who knows, I only know from reading, I don't know from experience, what goes on in some of these, truly occultic, satanic groups. The initiatory rites that go on, the blood sacrifices down to perhaps even human sacrifice. Well, those are much like the mystery religions. Now, therefore, if you want to think, well, that means the mystery religions came on the scene here and they've continued for the last, or for the next 2,000 years, in some form or another, as I've said, since we're talking about syncretism here, they've been on the scene probably from the very beginning. I mean, this is no new invention. For the first time, anyone ever thought of worshiping a demon with some of the ceremonies in one of these MRs. It's just it becomes widespread and wholesale as you join the West to the East and you surrender your desire to follow the Pantheon way of worship as well as EW, Emperor worship, and the only thing you have left are the mystery religions. And they are intriguing. If a person is of a baser sort, a baser nature, they would probably be something that one would enjoy. As I said, certainly the religious endeavors of the Pantheon and Pantheons and the EWs, the Emperor worship, lacked personal involvement. And that's exactly what you get here. But anyway, back to the oaths and the secret, elaborate initiatory rites. Let's discuss a little bit of this. Try to paint as good a picture as I can, although I've never been a part of an MR. Maybe some of you have. It might not have gone by the name MR, but I mean a really gross and base satanic or, I don't know, wicked group. Some of the books I read have things like this in them, so it's not something that you just find in Central America or the Amazon Valley or something. You find it right in New York and Boston. Now, the celebration ceremonies, we're under our second characteristic. Let me give you an A and a B under this. Doesn't matter if you divide it up. Just get the thought down.
For the
celebration ceremonies, we're under our second characteristic. Let me give you an A and a B under this. Doesn't matter if you divide it up. Just get the thought down. The celebration ceremonies revolved around seasonal changes. That sound familiar? Change of the seasons. See, this is nothing new, it's something old, but it is something new because it's syncretism. It's something new combined with something old. The celebration ceremonies revolved around seasonal changes that often concerned a goddess and her son, lover, or daughter who had died and was resurrected. What season of the year do you think would have been there? Well, I didn't get to finish the sentence. Spring for them was a time of rebirth. Chocolate eggs, jelly beans, Easter bunnies. See, we've studied this before. Fits right into mystery religion. And as we said on those tapes, you can open a encyclopedia set. It doesn't even have to be a Christian one. And you'll find these very things. Celebration ceremonies revolved around seasonal changes. Now, they would last all year. I mean, they would have different ceremonies at different times of the year, not just in the spring. But that was their favorite time. Because we've talked about this before, going way back to paganism, how people in antiquity were so dependent on nature, agriculture. Just think what we're going through right now. My wife and I keep talking to each other, I just can't wait till it's spring, can you? That's all we're talking about right now. Because you're getting close to that. You see snow on the ground, there's nothing you can do. It's just, everything's dead now. And so what you want is resurrection. Rabbits laying eggs and all of these miracles. What a miracle that a rabbit would lay an egg. I don't know that spring is my favorite time of year. I kind of like fall because you're tired of it being so hot and you're ready for it to snow and get cold. That's what's a blessing about living here. You get all of the seasons here. But I know we've been talking about that all the time the last couple of weeks. We can hardly wait till spring gets here. Green grass just makes you feel different right away. We'll discuss that in ethics. I mean, there are biological things about that, about the seasons. If you wonder why you change as things go from one season to another, there are very good explanations for all of that. There are things to offset it so you don't change so much. Let the seasons change and you stay okay. I'm talking about health-wise as well as in your mind, psychologically. So if I forget to deal with that in ethics, I'm sure someone will remind me. I don't have it down somewhere, but I know where I want to discuss that if and when we ever get around to that. Okay, let me give you this sentence over again since I've elaborated way too much on it. The celebration ceremonies revolved around seasonal changes that generally concerned a goddess. Now, not always, but generally concerned a goddess and either her son, her lover, or her daughter. Sometimes the son, sometimes the lover, sometimes the daughter. We'll kind of go back into the pantheons and pick up something as we get a little later in MR study. And we'll be back to whenever I was a pagan, my boyhood days, what my favorite story was from the pantheons, as I've already told you. That fits right into mystery religions as well, because it concerns Demeter and Persephone and the god of the underworld and her rape and so forth. So there's a daughter involved, a goddess and a daughter involved. But you see again, and by the way, before I go on, before I say again, notice on your outline letters C and D. New Testament appearances, and especially D for what I'm going to say now. D, alleged similarities between the mystery religions and Christianity. I mean, as you look through this, don't you see a lot of similarities? Personal involvement, deeper spirituality, afterlife, spiritual immortality. A goddess and her son. The son dies and is resurrected. You have Mary and Jesus. Spring, Easter, all these connections here. So there's one thing. There's a big characteristic under the elaborate initiatory rites. They would have a whole ceremony here. All right, secondly, under this second point, so we're on B, let's kind of develop what the initiatory rites were all about then. In other words, what these ceremonies were like. Usually, you'd have your assortment of initiatory rites, ceremonial procedures, such as the following. Not necessarily in this order. You would have an enacted play. You might call it a resurrection play or a resurrection drama, with stage, music, dance, costumes, actors, actresses. You might know from English history, this wasn't always true way back in history, although it's gone back a pretty good bit, that generally there were no such thing as actresses. Actors were always men, and if you wanted a woman or a girl, then you had a boy or a man dress up as one. That's just popular knowledge. We don't have actresses until fairly recent times. All the acting was done by men, and if you wanted a woman, you'd have a male dress up as her. But they did have actresses as well as actors involved. A resurrection drama. I mean with a stage. I mean with stunning stage and sound effects, light effects and everything. From what we know, this is true. Steven Spielberg's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. With music and dance, costumes, curtains, a change of scenery. The set, the props, everything. A resurrection drama. You'd have the giving or the exchange of presents. Oh, you would always have baptism. Some type of washing, to use a broader term than baptism. Baptism would seem to imply immersion of the whole self. Some form of purification, some form of washing. Many times it would actually be baptism. You'd always have baptism. In other words, the new adherents to your MR would be baptized. You would always have sacrifice. A festal meal would be shared among the cult's old and new members. Festal meal shared. You would have the unveiling of secret group objects. Now, this would be something like, and I'm not saying that one derives itself from the other, but it'd be something like the Catholic churches in Europe. We have them here in this country, but especially there because they're older there. The Catholic churches in Europe that have certain prized possessions, bones, all of this type of stuff, what's called religious relics, this traffic in relics there. Very precious material, precious as far as they're concerned, priceless material that is theirs, that belongs only to that group of people, only to that Catholic church right there. That would be your special sacred group object that you would have. Now, for these, it would be perhaps some statue, perhaps some wreath or garland, perhaps some part off a meteorite. Those always carried extraterrestrial messages. Well, you would think that they would, from coming from outer space and landing, and so you would have one, and this would belong to the group, and it had occult powers associated with it. And you see the same thing, type of thing goes on right on college campuses with sororities and especially with fraternities. They have their own secret group objects, things that they've collected that hold a certain religious connotation with them. And only the devotees, the adherents, the new members of that fraternity or sorority are allowed to see it. Then you'd have mass emotional and sexual frenzy, group copulation, orgies of every type and description. Describing one of the ceremonies now. This is what the mystery religion was all about. Now, I said not necessarily in this order, but probably you would start off with like a resurrection play, and you'd go through some of this. No one really knows what order to put it in, like whether you got baptized before you could come and even see the play, or you saw the play which prepared you for baptism, or, no one really knows what order. But throughout from the first step I've given you down to where we are right now, there would be mass emotionalism and sexual frenzy going on and taking place. However, there was an abrupt change whenever you got to the end of the ceremony. And this was the climax. This was that to which everything else was building. The end of the ceremony would turn silent, as opposed to this earlier frenzy. And the secret truths of the cult would be made known to the new initiates. That was the most important part of the ceremony. The words, the secret teachings of the cult. That's why it's the mystery religion, that you were not allowed to tell anyone what you saw, what you did, what you participated in, particularly not what you learned at the end of the ceremony. That would climax, that would be basically the culmination of that days, or sometimes they would last for a week or so, ceremony. And you can throw in, debauchery of every sort, drinking of wine, narcotics, just about everything involved in, until you get to the end here. Get to the end, silence, because the most important thing is passing along the truth that has been stored up with this particular MR. So there's the ceremony. There's a typical MR ceremony and some of the initiation rites involved. Notice some of those, do they not appear to be similar to Christianity? Baptism, various washings, sacrifice. Well, we don't do it, but we believe a lot about sacrifice, though. Emotional frenzy, well, you could have criticized Corinth for that. Some of these things are noticeably absent from Christianity, but there are a lot of things that are in Christianity. All right, another characteristic then. Now, I've just said this, but I want to separate it and make it a third one. Much personal emotional involvement, just so you have it separated. Because that's not only, and the reason I'm separating it, is that's not only true just of the ceremony, of that ceremony for the new initiates. That's just true of the whole group of people, even when they leave the ceremony and go back to work the next week or month or so. Much personal, emotional involvement. Fourthly, social equality prevailed among the devotees. See, here comes Christianity on the scene and destroys all these class distinctions. Social equality prevailed among the devotees. Now that's very appealing to people in an Eastern form of religion. I just finished last night reading Malcolm X's autobiography, the Black Panther, although he didn't like that term. It was coined by someone else and picked up by the media, and they would never drop it. But the one thing and he had been a Muslim for 12 years, serving the Honorable Elijah Muhammad back in the 1960s, before he ever went to Mecca to make his holy pilgrimage to the most holy of the holy cities of the Muslim Empire, which is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And of course, if you remember anything in the early 60s, he was assassinated in 1965. That was that decade of all those assassinations, Kennedy's and Malcolm X's going down left and right. Bad time, and we were all living back then. But if you remember much about Malcolm X, a fiery, oratorically gifted man and preacher. I mean, he had an 8th grade education. He learned everything that he knew in prison. And they finally sent him to prison for all of his running prostitution rings and peddling dope and all of this. Picked up a dictionary and read it from front to back until he knew all the words that he had never heard of before. And he hadn't heard of any of them in there, but ain't and shoot and couldn't and don't, and those are the only words he knew. You imagine doing that. Quite a man, quite a scholar by the time he got out. He spoke at Harvard and everywhere had him in because he could just tear the media up. They would try to trap him with a question, but he was much too brilliant for them. But anyway, what hate and racism he preached. The white man was a devil. Every white man had a devil living in him. Until he went to Mecca. And when he got to Mecca, the holy pilgrimage time of the season, there were devotees to the Islamic faith from all over the world. He said of every shape and size and color, everything from blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegians to the deepest dark-skinned Africans from South Africa. So all mixing together. And he said that was what convinced him, finally, even though he'd been in it for 12 years, that's what convinced him of the validity of the Islamic faith. He said, we're not like Christians fighting and segregating over there in America, and you've got the blacks here and the whites there, and the blacks go to their church and the whites go to theirs. What was he looking for? Social equality. That has a big appeal with a lot of people. And social equality prevailed among the devotees of mystery religions. He could be a king or emperor, or the servant of a king or emperor. And they'd be at the same ceremony, doing the same thing, bowing on the same grass before the same god or statue. And of course, this is what Malcolm Little or Malcolm X saw about the Islamic faith. It doesn't matter whether you were a king or the slave of a king. When it came time to worship Allah, all were on their knees before the same God. The ground was level at the foot of Allah. The ground was level at the foot of the mystery religions as far as social equality was concerned. So that's another characteristic. Then in the 5th place, they promised purification, spiritual purification in this life. Spiritual purification in this life. Now that speaks along the line of Romans chapters 1 and 2, that men know that they're sinners. Sometimes they don't admit it, sometimes they do. But they have a law written on their heart, even if they've never heard of Israel's law, capital L. They have a law, small l, written on their heart. And so these people know they've lived as pagans, worshiping Zeus. Now they want to be purified spiritually. Now if you ask, well, how could these ceremonies ever purify you spiritually? Well, that was just part of their religion, but they were still seeking spiritual, present purification. And then 6thly, immortality was promised for the next life. Spiritual immortality. These were the most powerful forms of religious expression among the pagans of the New Testament era. It was the tops of all religions. I think basically because of the personal involvement. Because what do you have here that you don't have somewhere else? You have your orgies with the pantheons as well. All could participate equally with one another and with the gods here. So it's probably the sense of personal inclusion in the mystery religions that gained them such widespread allegiance. Now, there's some discussion as to how large a role secret knowledge played in the mystery religions. Remember, in giving you the steps of the ceremony ends with a period of silence during which this knowledge is given to the new members. And there's some discussion as to how large a role this secret knowledge really played in the mystery religions. That is, how extensive the knowledge was. Was it a few sentences here or there about a topic or two? How extensive was the knowledge? Was it a whole corpus, a whole body of revelation? Or was it a thought or two? We know that during the 2nd century A.D., Gnosticism became full-blown in this regard. The Gnostics claimed a secret or a higher form of knowledge. Now, there's an incipient Gnosticism seen in the first century. That's reflected in some of the epistles, such as Colossians chapter 2, probably. Although Colossians 2 definitely involves syncretism as far as I'm concerned. Why don't we look at that passage? We've got a few moments tonight. I think we'll look at this again, but let me just show you what syncretism is all about. And I'll show you another passage as well, but let me show you this one. It's the first one that comes to my mind. We looked at it not long ago in this connection, that is an ITP connection. Colossians 2. Now the Colossian Christians, along with the other couple of cities there, like Laodicea, the Lycus Valley in Asia Minor, they had a minister, Epaphras, who had gone to Paul and evidently revealed to him some of the problems, the struggles through which they were going back at Colossae and Laodicea and the other church. I forget the name of the other one, but the other local church there. And so Paul writes to combat this. And he really delves into it in chapter 2. Now, if we start with verse 16 and go through verse 23, we've got time to do it tonight, so I wanted to do it this way next time we look at this passage, assuming that we come back to it. Tell me what type of false religion we're talking about as I read. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. What's that sound like to you? Judaism. That sounds like Judaism there. So are these Judaizers that are bothering the Colossians? Well, watch. These are a shadow of things which are to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you for the prize. Now, what does that sound like? Judaism? Well, not worship of angels. They never worshiped the angels. They knew, their one creed was the Lord our God is one Lord. That was their creed. They would never have worshipped angels. Remember, we've talked about Babylonian captivity, curing them of idolatry. That doesn't sound like them, but yet it's all here together in the same passage. Such a person goes into detail about what he has seen, and his unspiritual mind puffs him up with idle notions. He has lost connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows as God causes it to grow. Since you died with Christ to the basic principles of this world, why, as though you still belong to it, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Now, what's that sound like? All right, what's one form of Gnosticism, though? Asceticism. It's always the do-nots. These are all destined to perish with use because they are based on human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body. Harsh treatment of the body, asceticism. But they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence, as a description of a typical ceremony of MR would justify. So what do we have there? We have syncretism involved. We don't have Judaizers as such, not the Judaizers of Acts 15 or something. Ye must be circumcised and obey the law of Moses, because they wouldn't be involved in some of these other things mentioned here. But yet we don't have full-blown Gnosticism. Gnosticism doesn't even exist as full-blown till the 2nd century A.D. Certainly an incipient form of it here. It's latent here. Asceticism, mystery religion, what all do we have here? Well, it's a whole conglomeration of different religious notions. And it's best to look at this as a syncretistic type of religion. And I won't turn there, but Philippians chapters 3 and 4. No, let me take that back. Just chapter 3. I'm thinking of the beginning of the chapter and the end. Remember, he starts off Philippians 3 by saying, beware of the dogs, the evil dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision. Well, that seems to be a play, the concision, a play on the word circumcision, the Judaizers. But by the time you get to the end of Philippians 3, he's talking about these people whose God is their belly. Well, now that sounds like libertines, licentious people, just the opposite of ascetics, those who indulge, the hedonists, in other words. So, again, you've got probably either two different groups of people in Philippians 3, or you have syncretistic religion there. So, back to our question, though. How large a role does secret knowledge play? Let me give you what and I'll close with this tonight, one Theon of Smyrna, Theon. One Theon, Theon of Smyrna, has given us as a 5-stage description of the initiation-knowledge of the mystery religions. Number 1 was purification. In other words, this is not just what took place right during a ceremony. It seems like that some knowledge was given then, but they had other services that would take place after one's service of initiation, during which time more knowledge was given. In other words, it seems like the secret knowledge of the mystery religions probably played a fairly large role. That's not saying that the knowledge had to be some huge body of literature or something, but however much it was, it played a large role. That's what everything revolved around. You're being blessed with a secret knowledge. So there's an incipient form of Gnosticism right there, found here in the mystery religions. Purification, then secondly, an explanation of the rite with an exhortation to endure. An explanation of the rite with an exhortation to endure. That is, to further your discipleship in this new cult. Thirdly, a revelation of a sacred spectacle or a sacred group object. Again, to try to give you a parallel, if some of you, your minds aren't working, you're not thinking, I'll give you a parallel from my own life, just a very common sense type one. But we're talking here in the third point, a revelation of a sacred spectacle or a group, a sacred group object, something that belongs to the group. In other words, you'd feel privileged. You would know they accepted you, in other words, if they brought out of their treasury box this sacred object that you had never seen before. So, last time we were down south visiting my in-laws, my father-in-law, something he had never done for myself or my wife, his own daughter, before. He got out some sacred family objects. They were war films from Vietnam. When he was in Vietnam, he had two trips over to Vietnam in the late 1960s. And he brought those out and showed us all the films of his time in Vietnam, which some of them were not the prettiest films of what happened and what he was involved in. But he'd never done that before. Well, he's not going to do that the first time every young man tries to date his daughter. Well, come on in, I'll show you the Vietnam War films here. That's reserved for someone who's a part of the family. So there's a good modern-day explanation, and you probably experienced something like that. Your in-laws, they don't bring you totally into the fold till the right time, maybe after a few years, maybe after 50 years of marriage, making sure you treat their daughter or son okay. Then they hand over the heirlooms, or at least reveal the heirlooms in the safety deposit box to you and show you what it's all about. So there's a revelation of a sacred spectacle or a sacred group object. Fourthly, crowning with a garland or a wreath. Another stage here, a crowning with a garland or a wreath. See, last time we were home, we really had a blessed time with our in-laws, and we got a letter from him just the other day, or a few weeks ago, I guess it has been now, to me about some things, and it's just really good relationship that seems to be building there. He's just anti all forms of religion out there because he said all they do, they're hypocrites, all they do is beg for money and cheat meanwhile. But he knows we're different. He's known that all along, but he's just listening more, it seems like, though. Fifthly, and here's what I want to get to, here's what we'll end with tonight, because here's something totally different now than anything we've studied with paganism or with emperor worship or with the pantheons. Here's kind of the last step, and it's a step that you enter, but that you grow in the rest of your life as well. The happiness that you experience, happiness, now that's a term that none of these religions ever use. You're never happy about anything. The happiness of the person in knowing that he was beloved of the gods. Now that is something new. That is what appealed to people. Personal involvement, a personal relationship you could have with the gods. They weren't after your wife or your 18-year-old daughter. They were willing to have a relationship with you. Happiness in knowing that you are beloved of the gods. Now there is a change in religious expression in men's hearts. In religious expression, that desire, that craving is there all along. We want to serve a God, if we have any humanity to us at all, that loves us. We want to serve a God that loves us. We don't want to serve a God that hates us, that's out to get us. We want to serve a God that loves us. We want to be able to know that he loves us and experience his love. And as perverted as this is, and certainly was in MRs, nevertheless, I'm giving you just what has to be given because this is part of it. Happiness in knowing that one was finally loved by the gods. That brought one to maturity. Once you reach that, you had to grow in that as well. And again, a lot of that's very similar to Christianity.